voluntary about chemical castration and the Eighth Amendment, whether this would be cruel and unusual punishment. And I think that would be implicated by such a sentence. Whether it would count as cruel and unusual punishment, you'd have to count heads on the Supreme Court right now. And I don't know how that's going to come. I don't know where Justice Kennedy is on it, so I don't know how that's going to come out. But leave aside for a second the constitutional issues, because I think the cleverer or more appropriate way to do it isn't to say, Rushing, you've got to have surgery. It's, all right, Rushing, former student. This is why I'm picking on her. One of my former students. We're all former students. You can spend 10 years in prison for your crime, or you can have the surgery. Your choice. Should we allow that? It's voluntary, but an IRB wouldn't consider that voluntary, right? It's voluntary, but voluntary means different things in different contexts. In the criminal law context, voluntary doesn't mean very much, often. The voluntary stop where the policeman says, can I look in your trunk, and you know that otherwise you're going to get a ticket for something nasty, still counts as voluntary, even though, in fact, it may not be so voluntary. Well, we give her the option. Should we be able to do that? And I've come ultimately to the at least tentative conclusion that we should, as long as the alternative sentence is legitimate. If we said, we sentence you to the rack, we sentence you to Guantanamo, we sentence you to some terrible thing that we couldn't otherwise do, or you can have the brain surgery, that's not legitimate. That's not appropriate. But if it's, we sentence you to something that we can otherwise appropriately sentence you to, but give you the choice of this alternative, I think as a general matter, we would have to let competent adults make that decision. As a general matter, with competent adults. Of course, that raises a couple of things. What's the non-general situation? And what about people who aren't competent adults? And many of these interventions one might well want to try with people who aren't competent adults, particularly in light of the fact that an awful lot of crime is committed by people who are under 18 and who are likely to have long careers over 18 of committing crime. And a fair amount of crime is committed by people who may not be competent fully. So I don't have an answer at this point to people who aren't competent adults and what we should do with them. I think that is difficult and requires further thought and work, at least by me, further thought from me before I have a conclusion. I do have some thoughts on the special cases. When might we not let somebody choose a brain-directed intervention? Would there ever be any circumstances where we could say 10 years in prison or X, but it's wrong for us to offer you X. It's wrong for us to allow you to choose X. And there are two things that at least in greater and lesser extent appeal to me as possible candidates for that paternalistic intervention. One is an intervention that would grossly reduce one's intelligence. Now, this may be just a bias of somebody who I think is probably, slightly above average intelligence in a room full of people of far above average intelligence. I think academics tend to prize intelligence perhaps more than most people do. But the idea of saying, okay, you can choose this and it will reduce your IQ to 60, reduce you to a level of mental retardation from a normal level, that seems wrong to me. I'm not sure why. That seems an affront, a taking away of humanity, and I say that without intending to question the humanity of the mentally retarded. But to deprive somebody to take them to a level below competence, to allow them to voluntarily choose that, seems to me offensive, to the extent that I, at least as a policy matter, leaving aside questions of what I would do if I were Justice Kennedy and it were an Eighth Amendment question, as a policy matter, I wouldn't want to go there. That's the greater of the greater and the lesser. The lesser, we get into science fiction here, I'm afraid. Imagine a treatment that basically wiped clean your personality. You continued to be the same body. Maybe you continued to have some basic level of societal knowledge. This gets tricky. Would you have to relearn English? Would you have to relearn how to dress yourself? But for current purposes, let's say you've got a baseline, but your personality is now gone, plastic, to be recreated. Would we let somebody do that? In a sense, it's kind of a capital punishment issue. If we did that to Stephen Morse would be gone. It'd be somebody who looked like Stephen Morse, although he might, for once in his life, not wear a tie and a nice sport coat. He might be dressed more slovenly like me. This would be a huge change, but I'd know that's not Stephen Morse. That sure looks like Stephen Morse, but it's his warped twin brother. Should we allow that? And that sounds pretty obscure, but one can imagine somebody who said, I've done terrible things. I hate myself. I hate what I am. I hate what I've done. I'd like a fresh start. Do we allow them to do that? There is kind of an analogy in Texas, which a few years ago, about 10 years ago, passed a law authorizing surgical castration for certain sex offenders. A bioethicist was heavily involved in this statute, Bill Winslade, from medical branch in the University of Houston, medical branch in Galveston. And it's a fascinating statute because it has extensive requirements for psychological counseling, for independent assessment of the reality of this person's wish, there's no possibility that your sentence will be changed. You're told up front there is no way this will change your parole or your sentence, and you're told that over and over again, and in fact they've never changed a person's after that. And I talked to Bill and I said, well, why would anybody do it? He said, we get a few, not many, patients who say, I hate what I am, I hate what I do. I can't stop it, stop me. And one could imagine something similar with this personality wipe. So I think there are a lot of interesting normative questions which I've just scratched the surface of in terms of if this were safe and effective, would we think it was appropriate to use it as a compulsory matter, as a choice of this or another sentence? How would we use it with respect to juveniles or people of minimal competence? Would there be any limits as to the interventions we would use? All of this is speculative. And let me conclude by saying a word about that. A few years ago, I was at a hotel lobby at a conference, and I ran into a British, I don't know what he calls himself, not a bioethicist, but a British observer of these issues, academic named Nick Rose. And Nick lit into me. I think it was about lie detection. I'd been talking about Fifth Amendment consequences of effective lie detection and whether it would fall within the privilege against self-incrimination, et cetera. He said, every time you talk about that, people think it's real. That you need to point out it's not real, that it doesn't work yet, that it may not work. There are all sorts of questions about whether it could work. And so I took that to heart. He was right. He kicked me in the rear wisely. We have to work on two levels in this area and in similar bioscience and law areas. First, we have to focus on today. Does this work? How well does it work? How would we know whether it works? What's a good test for whether it works? Is this ready to be used, and how would we know when it's ready to be used? And for that, most of what I've talked about is not in use, though some of it is. Some of it will never, I suspect, be in use. Some of it will be, and some that I haven't thought about will also undoubtedly be used. And as these things come on the horizon, and we have enough facts about the individual cases, we have to look, is this ready, is this not ready, how do we know? At the same time, though, I think it is useful for us to, bearing in mind the current uncertainty and state of knowledge, to think about, well, what would happen if it were useful, if it were effective? What would we do then? In an effort to prepare ourselves and prepare the discussion for the rest of society to then tap into, to make decisions about how things should be used. If it doesn't work, it's pretty easy to come up with a good policy recommendation. If it doesn't work, don't use it. If it's broke, don't use it. If it's not broke, then do you use it or not? If it works, do you use it or not? And I think this more speculative, future-looking direction is also important. But it's kind of, trying to do two different things at the same time. Be focused on the present or the near future, and be focused more speculatively, and we need to remember both of them. And let me end by coming back to Elliot Valentine.